Snow muffled everything that winter, the crunch of boots, the low rumble of plows, even the soft creak of my own mailbox hinge. The red stood out like a heartbeat in all that white. Bright, unapologetic, and warm against the frost. That's why I'd chosen it, long before the letter arrived. Long before the fine. The letter had bold black ink that seemed to bleed through the envelope. Non-compliant mailbox color, it said. Fine, $250. No preamble, no warning, no courtesy call. Just a line of accusation and a due date stamped for the 15th. I remember reading it twice, maybe 3 times, in disbelief. After 22 years in that same snowy townhome complex, after shoveling half the sidewalks myself when the landscapers didn't show, I was suddenly a rule breaker for the color red. What happens when a resident finds a 1997 loophole before the next board vote? That was the question I didn't know I'd answer by the end of this cold, drawn-out feud. I didn't know that one petty fine would uncover the buried secrets of a homeowners association that had forgotten its own foundation, literally, in the paperwork buried beneath layers of time. Back then, my little neighborhood was the picture of calm suburban winter. Rows of identical white-trimmed townhouses, evenly spaced like soldiers. Neighbors waved, exchanged casseroles, shared shovels. But every HOA has its shadows, its hierarchy of personalities hiding behind warm smiles. Ours revolved around a woman named Marcia Keller, the newly elected HOA president. People called her the Rule Whisperer. She treated the covenant book like a sacred text, quoting section numbers in casual conversation. I used to think it was quirky. Until the fines started piling up for everyone who didn't match her snow globe vision of order. There was Bob in Unit 12B who hung a flag that wasn't the approved size, fined $75. Then Lila next door, who had string lights one color tone too warm. And me, well, my offense was a shade of red. To be specific, crimson heritage red, the same hue as my father's old postbox from his farm days. He'd painted it before mailing his last letter to me from overseas, decades ago. That mailbox had meaning. I wasn't about to let a committee dictate the color of my memories. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe an overzealous rule checker had gone through old records. But when I looked closer, there it was, plain as day, mailboxes must be neutral tones as defined by the 2005 Community Color Chart. Neutral. Gray, beige, white. No red, no blue, nothing that brought warmth to the snow. Still, something about the tone of the notice felt off. The letter wasn't signed by the full board, it only had Marcia's initials, MK. Usually, they went through the property manager. This one didn't. And there was another line at the bottom, faint but readable, referencing CCR Section 4.3, Uniformity of Exterior Fixtures. CCR Section 4.3. I'd never heard of it before. But that was my first breadcrumb. What I didn't know then was that Section 4.3 hadn't existed in its current form since 1997, and the copy they used to fine me came from a handbook that wasn't even legally valid anymore. I walked through the snow the next morning, letter in hand, straight to the HOA office. The whole complex was blanketed in quiet, except for the sharp hum of the snowblower echoing between the garages. Inside, the air was stale, paper, coffee, and the faint scent of self-importance. I met the property manager, a younger guy named Tom who looked perpetually tired. He scanned my letter, frowned, then glanced at the screen. He said my violation had been logged by the president herself, manual entry. That was unusual. I asked for the records, the past violation reports for mailbox colors. None showed up since 1998. Over 25 years without a single fine for mailbox paint. Yet somehow, I was the outlier. That's when my curiosity started turning into resolve. Marcia was planning something. And whatever it was, my red mailbox was just the pretext. In the HOA newsletter that week, a new item appeared, discussion item, Enforcement Consistency Review, February 2nd Board Meeting. It mentioned mailbox uniformity again, subtly worded, but clearly aimed at me. I wasn't just fighting over paint anymore. I was being made an example of. That night, I poured myself a cup of coffee and started digging through my own HOA folder, a mess of old dues receipts, landscaping updates, and bylaws I never thought I'd need. But tucked near the bottom was a yellowed, stapled packet labeled Original Declaration of Covenants, 1997. There it was, the earliest version of our rules, printed when the development first broke ground. Section 4.3 was shorter back then, simpler. And most importantly, it specifically listed mailbox color and finish optional within aesthetic reason, provided maintained condition. I sat back, smiling for the first time in weeks. That was the crack in their armor. But I needed proof that my mailbox fell under that older rule, and I'd have to find it before the next board vote. The clock was ticking. 5 days until February 2nd. If I couldn't find what I needed, they'd fine me again, or worse, file for a lien. The snowstorm that followed was brutal. Roads closed, power flickered, and temperatures dropped below zero. But even that didn't stop Marcia. I saw her out in her parka one morning, clipboard in hand, inspecting mailboxes like a general surveying troops. Every neighbor's postbox gleamed in dull beige or gray. Mine stood out, a red speck of rebellion against a sea of compliance. When she stopped in front of my unit, she wrote something on her pad and took a photo. That was it. No wave. No smile. Just silent judgment in the falling snow. I knew she'd use it in the next meeting as evidence. And that's when I decided I wouldn't just fight back, I'd win in a way she'd never forget. On the evening of January 29th, with snow piled knee-deep and my driveway frozen solid, I drove to the county archives. The building was nearly empty, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the rustle of paper. I told the clerk I needed records on the Lakeside Townhome Association, Incorporation and Covenant Amendments, 1997 through 2005. She handed me a box. Inside, among brittle folders and faded ink, I found what I didn't even know I was looking for, a stamped, notarized amendment request from 2005 that had never been approved by the County Planning Commission. That meant the HOA's updated CCR Section 4.3 wasn't legally binding. They'd been citing an unenforced draft for nearly 2 decades. I took a photo of the notarized stamp, returned without filing, missing board signature. Dated June 3, 2005. Evidence Prop Number 1, Unfiled Amendment Copy, Section 4.3, June 3, 2005. They thought I was just a quiet veteran with a red mailbox. But now I held the paper that could unravel their entire authority. The next morning, I made copies. One for myself, one for the board, and one for the county clerk's office, just in case. I wasn't naive. Marcia had allies, and she'd twist the rules any way she could. Neighbors started whispering. They'd seen me in the archives, in the office, walking the complex with papers in hand. I could feel their curiosity mixing with quiet hope. Because in every HOA, there's always one person everyone wishes would be put in their place. Marcia's weekly inspection emails suddenly stopped. Then came a new message: board meeting moved to community hall due to anticipated attendance. They were expecting a show. And I was ready to deliver. The night before the meeting, the snow fell heavy again, muting everything in silver silence. I stood outside, looking at that red mailbox gleaming under the streetlight. It wasn't just metal and paint anymore, it was a statement. A stand against pettiness. Against power abused in the name of order. 5 minutes later, I slipped the photo evidence into a folder labeled CCR Filing Discrepancy. The stage was set. The only thing left was to show up and make the board confront its own forgotten past. The community hall that night was filled with the kind of energy you could almost hear, the low murmur of whispers, the shuffle of boots shedding snow, the creak of folding chairs. People came out not for policy, but for spectacle. It wasn't every day that the HOA faced public challenge, especially from someone like me. Marcia stood at the front of the room, spine straight, lips tight. Her stack of folders was perfectly aligned, the papers crisp. Behind her sat the rest of the board, 3 members who looked more like hostages than colleagues. The fluorescent lights flickered once, catching the edge of my red folder as I took a seat. Everyone knew why I was there. It wasn't just about a mailbox anymore, it was about control. About whether the rules applied to the people who wrote them, too. The meeting began as all HOA meetings do, dry, procedural, numb. Budget approvals, landscaping bids, maintenance complaints. Then came item 4, mailbox uniformity enforcement. Marcia cleared her throat. She announced that a homeowner had violated the long-standing color standard and that consistent enforcement was critical to maintaining property values. She didn't need to say my name. All eyes turned to me anyway. What she didn't realize was that in 5 minutes, her own rulebook would testify against her. I raised my hand, calmly, and asked to respond. Marcia tried to wave me off, citing procedure. But murmurs grew until one of the board members, clearly uncomfortable, suggested I be allowed to speak. I stood up, unzipped my red folder, and began to read aloud, not from a speech, but from their own documents. CCR Section 4.3, Uniformity of Exterior Fixtures. I read the clause, word for word, the same one they'd used against me. Then I laid my evidence on the table. County record, returned without filing, June 3, 2005. Missing board signature. The words landed like an icicle breaking off a roof. Sharp. Cold. Irrefutable. A few gasps rippled through the room. Marcia blinked, her eyes darting between the printout and her own folder. Her copy of the rule looked identical, except for the lack of a filing stamp. That's when the treasurer, Mr. Hahn, leaned forward and asked the question that shattered the illusion: how long had the HOA been enforcing an unfiled amendment? The silence that followed was louder than any argument. I explained, clearly and calmly, that the original 1997 declaration, still valid, allowed mailbox color variation within aesthetic reason. I even showed a photograph of my mailbox beside a neighbor's, both clean, well-kept, freshly painted. Then I added something I'd discovered only hours earlier, a 2001 newsletter archived by the town library that congratulated residents for their creative mailbox updates. There was even a photo, half the mailboxes were colored then. Evidence prop number 2, 2001 community newsletter, Mailbox Creativity Contest. Marcia's face flushed redder than my mailbox. The crowd began murmuring again, this time with a different tone. Agreement. Admiration. Vindication. That's when she tried her last defense. She claimed the amendment was assumed valid through practice, that precedent made it binding. But precedent doesn't outrank legality. And in that moment, every homeowner knew it. She'd fined half the block for rules that weren't even official, and the whispers spreading through the room promised that her days as president were numbered. After the meeting adjourned, people approached me, neighbors who'd stayed silent for years. They thanked me quietly, some even laughed, relieved. But Marcia didn't speak a word. She left the room with her folders clutched like armor, disappearing into the cold night. The next morning, an email arrived from the HOA office. It wasn't an apology. It was a temporary suspension of enforcement pending legal review. But I knew what that meant, they were stalling. And so, I prepared for round 2. I started documenting everything, copies of bylaws, scanned letters, timestamps of each communication. I even printed the metadata from the HOA's public filings, showing exactly which documents had never been notarized. Evidence prop number 3, document index summary, filing metadata extract. Days later, Marcia called an emergency closed meeting. Rumors spread fast. Some said she wanted to reinstate the fines. Others said she was planning to call for my mailbox removal under aesthetic conflict. But I had already sent my packet to the county compliance division. If the HOA tried to enforce anything based on an invalid bylaw, they'd be in violation themselves. And the timing couldn't have been more poetic. The county was conducting its own review of HOA filings that month, checking for procedural errors. Within 72 hours, an inspector reached out requesting clarification from our association. They wanted to see the official signed copy of the 2005 amendment. Of course, it didn't exist. The deadline for submission was Friday at 4 p.m., and failure to produce it would trigger a state compliance review that could suspend the HOA's authority altogether. Friday came fast. The snow had finally eased, leaving icy piles like frozen barricades along the driveways. I watched through my window as board members came and went from the office, carrying stacks of files and clipboards, faces drawn tight with panic. By noon, the tension in the air was almost electric. The whole neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Someone had heard that Marcia blamed the former board, another said she accused the property manager. But when 4 p.m. hit, silence. No announcement. No email. No update. Then, at 5:27, a message landed in my inbox: community update, governance pause pending review. They'd failed to submit proof. The county had flagged their bylaws for procedural audit. I sat back in my chair, exhaling steam into the winter air. They'd fine me for my mailbox. Now, their entire rulebook was on hold because of it. In just 2 weeks, the HOA had gone from fining me over paint to facing official scrutiny for decades of misfiled documents. Their overreach had exposed their own foundation cracks, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. But I wasn't done. The mailbox fine had been revoked, sure, but that wasn't justice. Not yet. Justice would mean accountability. Transparency. Change. I reached out to the other homeowners, drafted a petition for a board vote of no confidence. I explained everything clearly: the unfiled amendments, the misuse of authority, the fabricated enforcement logs. To my surprise, signatures flooded in, 27 in the first day, 40 by the end of the week. People who'd stayed quiet for years finally found their voice. Snow came again that March, thick, heavy, and strangely quiet, the kind of snow that makes time feel slower. The recall was over, the vote sealed, and Marcia's rulebook lay buried under a fresh layer of powder and pride. But even after the victory, I felt something gnawing inside me. Because justice isn't just about removing a tyrant. It's about repairing the ground they cracked. And my community still stood divided. Half of them wanted peace, the other half wanted payback. I wasn't interested in vengeance. What I wanted was balance, the kind that lasts. So, when the new interim president, a quiet accountant named Peter Lang, called and asked me to join the Compliance Review Committee, I said yes. Not out of spite, but out of duty. It was strange walking back into that office, the same sterile walls, same hum of the heater, same faint scent of toner and dust, but this time, the air didn't feel oppressive. For the first time in months, the HOA wasn't a battleground. It was a chance to rebuild. Peter's first order of business was clear: clean the books. He wanted every covenant, every amendment, every vote verified and digitized. The goal was simple: make the association transparent. I volunteered to help audit the archive. There was something poetic about that: me, the guy who'd been fined for defying the rules, now sorting through them to restore fairness. We found a mess, of course. Missing signatures. Duplicated entries. 3 separate revisions of the same landscaping policy, all with different dates. But the worst was buried in a folder labeled Community Aesthetics, Color Guidelines. Inside was a memo from 2005, hand-signed by Marcia herself. Effective immediately, mailboxes shall be limited to neutral tones, pending official filing. The word pending was underlined twice. That memo, never filed, never approved, had been the ghost haunting our neighborhood for 2 decades. We scanned it, logged it, and flagged it for removal. That single document had caused over 40 recorded fines in the years after 2005. $250 here, $100 there, small enough for people to pay and move on. But together, it painted a picture of quiet control. The board hadn't just overreached, they'd built an entire history of fines on a foundation that never legally existed. I decided to go further. If we were cleaning the past, we were going to clean all of it. I pulled every fine record since the HOA's creation, 1997 to 2024. Line by line, I noted the patterns. Marcia's presidency had begun in 2017. That's when the numbers spiked: mailbox violations, porch decor citations, holiday light complaints. Before her, the HOA averaged 5 citations per year. Under her leadership, that number jumped to nearly 60. People weren't disorderly, they were living. Decorating. Adding color to their lives. I prepared a full report, presented it at the next open board meeting, and read the conclusion aloud. Selective enforcement erodes trust faster than snow melt in March, I said. This board has an obligation to restore fairness, not fear. The room stayed silent for a long moment before the applause began, not loud, not explosive, but steady, genuine. The following week, the board voted unanimously to refund every improperly issued fine since 2005. For some, it was only $50 or $75. For others, it was hundreds. But the gesture mattered more than the amount. For the first time, the HOA wasn't just correcting a mistake, it was acknowledging it. That spring thaw came late. Patches of snow still clung to the corners of roofs and mailbox posts as if they didn't want to let go. But slowly, color returned. Neighbors repainted doors, added planters, even refurbished old mailboxes. Beige gave way to blues, greens, even the occasional bold red. It wasn't chaos, it was character. One afternoon, I walked past a young couple on the corner, brushing fresh teal paint onto their mailbox. They smiled nervously, asking if it was allowed. I laughed. If it's well kept and makes you smile, it's allowed. They laughed too, relief in their voices, and for the first time in years, the air around here felt alive again. But then came something unexpected. An envelope slipped into my mailbox one rainy morning, addressed only to resident. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Marcia's handwriting. I was wrong, it read. But I did what I thought was best. Maybe now you'll do better. No signature. No apology. But still, it felt like closure. Sometimes, the most satisfying revenge isn't humiliation, it's transformation. Making something better than the smallness that tried to control it. In May, we held our first Community Day. Not the usual potluck or lawn contest, this one had a different purpose. A symbolic restart. Everyone brought something small that represented individuality. One man hung up vintage lanterns, a teacher painted a tiny mural on her garage wall, a widow planted a lilac bush near the signpost. And me? I repainted my mailbox again. Same shade. Crimson Heritage Red. But this time, I added a brass plate beneath it with the inscription, "In memory of honest neighbors and honest rules." People stopped to read it, some chuckled, others nodded silently. It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was remembrance. Even the new board approved it unanimously, officially, publicly, proudly. Months later, as summer bloomed, I got a call from the county compliance officer who'd first investigated the HOA's filings. She told me our association had become a model of procedural reform. They were even using our cleanup process as a case study for other neighborhoods. Imagine that, a story that started with a $250 fine ending with a state commendation. It felt surreal. But poetic. I thought back to those quiet winter nights, shuffling papers under a desk lamp, the smell of old ink and dust, the sound of the wind outside. I'd gone into that archive searching for a loophole, and what I found was something more meaningful, a community's memory waiting to be restored. It made me realize something simple but powerful: rules are meant to protect people, not control them. And sometimes, the only way to fix a broken system is to face it head-on, paper by paper, clause by clause, until the truth has nowhere left to hide. I still live here. The snow still comes every year, and my red mailbox still gleams through it all. New neighbors move in and ask why the mailboxes come in so many colors now. I tell them it's a long story. Then I smile and say it started with one red box and a stubborn old man who hated beige. But deep down, I know it wasn't about paint. It was about standing up when something small and petty becomes something bigger, a test of principle. Because that's how most HOA nightmare stories begin, isn't it? A color, a fence, a garden gnome, and before long, it's not about the object anymore. It's about control. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people refuse to bow to pettiness, neighborhoods might start looking less like regulations, and more like homes. Sometimes, when I walk past the office, I still hear echoes of the old arguments. But they don't sting anymore. Peter keeps the bylaws updated now, digitally, transparently, publicly accessible. Every homeowner gets a copy once a year. No surprises. No secret clauses. He asked me to lead a small group called the Fair Practice Committee. Our mission is to review every policy that could be abused or misinterpreted. We call it the Red Mailbox Rule, a reminder that no regulation should ever outlast its reason. It's a fitting legacy. A few weeks ago, a neighbor I barely knew came by with coffee. He said his father used to live in a similar HOA down south and got fined for hanging a wind chime. He told me my story gave him courage to speak up at his own meeting. That hit me harder than any applause or reimbursement ever could. Because that's what real victory looks like, quiet ripples of courage spreading beyond your own fence line. Sometimes, it's not about the war you win, but the peace you inspire afterward. And as I stood there, watching the snow melt into the earth, I realized I'd never look at that red mailbox the same way again. It wasn't defiance anymore. It was history. So when people ask how it all ended, if I ever forgave the board, or Marcia, or the ridiculous rules, I tell them yes, in a way. Because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to let bitterness define you. The mailbox still shines bright. The community's thriving. And every snowfall now feels like a fresh start, white canvas, red streak, clean heart. Maybe that's the best revenge of all. Tell me your HOA horror story in one line, I'll see if it tops my red mailbox saga.